CRS Essential Updates, hosted by Lori Lair with many great guests. A few technical items on the GoToWebinar dashboard or control panel. You'll want to close all your unnecessary browsers and programs that use the internet so you'll get a better connection. The audio tab, if you're having problems, you can go to the audio tab and click no audio and then back onto audio. And a lot of times that will resolve your issues or your problems. And if you're on the phone, you need to put in your PIN number and that will show your name and you'll be able to speak. I will be unmuting everybody, so please keep yourself muted. And when we have a question, you'll raise your hand and we'll ask you to speak. Also, if you can't talk, use the questions tab to put in your questions. And when it's time, we'll go to that and read your question for the speaker to answer. If you have any questions in the background, you can email me at training@flfloods.org, or you can put your question in the questions box and I'll be looking at that. To get your credits for the class, you must be attentive and answer the poll questions. In about 2 or 3 weeks, you will receive an email from Club Express with the links to your certificate, the class PowerPoints, and the recording of the class. So with that, let's start out with a poll question because everybody wants to know who's out there. Who are we talking to? So our first poll question, and I'm going to launch it. What's your primary role or profession related to floodplain management? Select all that apply. Are you a floodplain manager, a building code official, a CRS coordinator, an emergency management person, or an insurance agent? So click all that apply. And if you're in full screen mode, you may have to come out of full screen mode to vote. And we're getting there. So what is your job related to floodplain management?
Hey, Sally.
Yes, ma'am.
Some of us, the system's only letting us choose one. It's not letting us choose multiples today.
Ooh. Okay, then put, if you have multiples, go ahead and put it in the questions box. Now we're going to close and share. So we have 43% that are floodplain managers, 10% are building code officials, 38% are CRS coordinators, and then we have 10% emergency management, which, let me see if there's anybody in the questions. Another CFM in our questions box. So we have a good mix here. Whoops, and I just lost that. Hold on, hide. All right, with that out of the way, let me introduce Lori Lair. Lori is the owner of Lori Lair LLC, former CRS ISO specialist and lead instructor for the 278 CRS course. She has over 20 years of experience in the field of floodplain management and the community rating system. We are thankful and privileged to have her on our team of instructors. With that, Lori, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. And I feel privileged to be a part of the organization and to be hosting this fabulous lineup today. And so I think with that, we do have a jam-packed schedule. I didn't write a break into this morning, so if you need to take a quick break, do that. You know, we might have a break somewhere in between speakers that we'll be able to take a quick 10 or something of that sort. But let's get started. So Alex joins us this morning and is going to bring to us some information and something that we probably all sort of cringe when we start facing our verification visits is how are we going to map our open space or get our base map for mapping almost everything that we need to map for an impact adjustment when you're talking about CRS credits. And I have worked with Alex on a couple of other projects. And most recently, we worked on Jupiter Island and looking at their open space and maximizing credit for open space. So Alex he has a bachelor's degree in science and environmental science and geography from Stetson University. And he is also a GIS specialist, and I don't want to take up a lot of time reading all of his credentials. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alex, and I will send out his bio to those folks who want to know more about Alex's background. So Alex is going to kind of take us on a journey of how we do this mapping for open space. So Alex, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks a lot for joining us and agreeing to take the early morning spot.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for the invite and the introduction. As Gloria said, my name's Alex Zelenski, and I'll be talking about kind of the web of data that went into mapping open space, as Gloria had said, for Jupiter Island's re-verification, and dive into a little bit of the lessons learned to provide some higher level GIS guidance during that re-verification process. For context, Jupiter Islands in the coast of Martin County, there's a map there that shows the red portion along the coastline there, and in the project, we were working on the program data table, tried to assist a little bit with the map information service, and then maps the relevant components in activity 400. And that's the impact adjustments and the open space calculations and that side of it. With the CRS program data table, if you haven't seen it before, here it is. Basically, you're trying to quantify what happened within a jurisdiction as it relates to the special flood hazard area and how that's related to past submittals and stuff. But with Jupiter Island, some of this information we just didn't really have available at the time of the analysis, given the timeline of the project. And for example, like 2 to 5 can definitely be answered through like building permitting and historic data with the previous submittals. And I'm sure there's a bunch of other avenues that can be found, but given the timeline of the re-verification process that we had, it wasn't necessarily practicable. But the overall kind of overarching goals of the projects were to assist with the data collection efforts, conduct the geospatial analysis, and create the necessary supporting documents, and a web utility for sharing that information out. But the goals here say simple mapping, and I think actually that it's more appropriate to say targeted mapping, because the mapping process itself is definitely at face value pretty complicated, but as you kind of dive into it, it does get a little easier. It's just getting the ball rolling that seems to be the hurdle that it comes up. But as far as available tools go to do this kind of thing, FEMA's Map Service Center is a great foundational area. The National Flood Hazard Layer, FIRMETs, DFIRMs, basically the flood insurance rate maps. But for actually preparing the information, you've got all sorts of GIS platforms. And then if you don't really have access to GIS platforms, like Esri's ArcMap or QGIS and Mapbox and that kind of thing, you can use a grid overlay, which in the bottom right, that picture there is kind of a hand sketch of what that would look like. And there's guides all over crsresources.org with that. But of course, along with GIS and kind of the powers of mapping and analytics there, the municipal codes and the regulations of the community, and then the community rating system, coordinators manual, the modules, the program data table, all that kind of feeds into each other. But the flood insurance rate maps are probably the foundation to all that. But when I talk about the web of data, I'm referring to all the inputs that are required to accurately map this kind of thing. And it's open space being a big section of what we worked on. But on the left in this slide, you'll see some of the data asks that went along with it. And on the right, you can see where some of it was located. I would definitely, moving forward into your own communities, definitely explore the world of open data and open source platforms. Sometimes the barriers to entry with GIS can be problematic, but there are ways to minimize that. Specific to Jupiter Island, for example, they didn't have a concrete building or a building footprint database that we can use to kind of talk about impervious surfaces in this calculation, and that we actually found in a Microsoft Open Data project. So that there's definitely some interoperability there between types of information and sources. With the methodology foundation to do all the mapping, of course, it's all embedded within the CRS manual. But on the right there, this is just the table of contents section, and it's just some of one particular activity series, the mapping and regulations part of it. And now, presentation-wise, we're about halfway through, so I just wanted to do a little recap and make sure you're paying attention. There's not questions, so you don't need to pull up a poll, but the general flow so far, the CRS manual is the foundation. There's all sorts of GIS resources to use. Use what's available to you, though, so you don't necessarily have to use the MacDaddy GIS programs. Like even there's the grid overlay and paper maps that you can use. So keep it simple. Don't overwhelm yourself with the complexity of the technology. The goal is to quantify information for community response there. But I found this resource incredibly helpful in mapping the open space preservation areas within Jupiter Island. The top bar there, you see home, manual, 100 series, so on and so forth. That's actually where you'll click and find the segmented information. What we focused on in that module series was the activity 400, and it does, at least in my opinion, a great job at simplifying the manual a little bit into groupings, and each one of those groupings, as you can see on the image to the right, the modules touch on multiple activities, so there's a lot of opportunity for credit allocation in those activities. But compared to the manual, I'd say the guides that are on csresources.org are more geared towards the kind of traditional map production methodologies and thought process. That some of it can be a little cryptic just because it's CRS, of course, but it's more of a step 1, step 2, step 3 kind of workflow. And on the right, as I said, there was the multiple activities feeding into this one module. So while you're making an impact adjustment map and you're working through the open space calculations and stuff, all that feeds back to like the program data table, which is, I believe it's activity series 200. But the important part is that it's easier to understand, and it gets you started in the right direction, but it doesn't necessarily replace the manual. It's not as extensive. So yeah, to kind of touch a little bit more into the details of the methodology, we use zoning and future land use data. The parcels, we extracted property owner and like parcel ID and that kind of thing, building footprints, of course. The shoreline for this particular project was a little tricky because there was some beach renourishment that didn't necessarily make it to other data sets, but that's fine. And then, of course, like conservation lands, and that at the first, I guess, introduction to the conservation lands was just kind of a conversation between Ruben and I, where it was trying to figure out which parcels were associated with that. So there's all sorts of challenges that come along with dealing with this type of data. But in general, you'll set up your GIS and do an overlay analysis and quantify where those areas are coming from. And again, I'm just going to stress, use csresources.org to guide that actual operation and mapping output. You'll thank me later. With lessons learned, there's 3 lessons learned that you'll find here. But the parcel data set's probably the most important on top of the FEMA flood mapping there, because each area credited in the corresponding tables needs to have some parcel ID to it. And specific to Jupiter Island, the water bodies and waterward property boundaries kind of made it weird, because a water body is not a parcel ID. So how do you correct that kind of in this CRS method here? And with what we ended up doing was kind of generalizing some of the areas around that the shoreline and massaged it into an actual parcel. But yeah, with the second lesson learned here is not all data sets talk to each other, and that's due to time, maintenance, some constraint like formatting, and the kind of big takeaway here is interdepartmental and interagency communications take time. For Jupiter Island, like I had mentioned earlier, that beach renourishment project, it wasn't captured within, say, the city limits file. And then that, of course, didn't make it over to the parcel data set. So with the stacking of all that information, it kind of took some aerial interpretation versus the kind of GIS figuring to figure out how to deal with the discrepancies there. And even down to like zoning, we actually digitized one of the map series because I couldn't necessarily find the GIS file right away. But that says lessons learned 3, but that should say learned. And then starting, the third one there is starting the data hall for re-verification as early as possible, just to kind of give some of that interdepartmental time there. And the specific to Jupiter Island, what I was thinking about here while I wrote this was overall time constraints and data availability when we were trying to crunch through this. It's some of what would have been the ideal ask just seemed to take way too much time to actually put into practice. So having a completely digitized polygon of impervious surface areas would be super helpful. And then things like up-to-date shorelines and that kind of thing. But with kind of the activity in a community, sometimes that is not at all possible. But again, this is just stressing kind of work with what you've got. But it's something to kind of keep in mind while you're going through these different processes. The different departments all have their own planning initiatives, and if the floodplain managers can make the case that they need an impervious surface area polygon for CRS data verification purposes, that data set can also be used, say, for stormwater engineering. So that's kind of a cool aspect of what can go on. So some general common challenges, at least for what I could come up with, is the interdepartmental and interagency data transfers there can be challenging. Not everything is always stored in the same formats. Like some things are just available in PDFs, some are Excel tables, some are full-blown GIS databases, and then of course you've got like the cloud environments that kind of feed into all of that. But there's numerous classifications and all sorts of data to manipulate, and that data sometimes puts people to sleep. But it's kind of, you've got to have the balance between a simple and meaningful map environment, and then also you can be super overloading and put a bunch of information in there that just makes the final product a little muddy, which isn't necessarily the best there. But the takeaway for the challenges here is basically not everything can be answered with a download or an online search. Sometimes a phone call is kind of what can grease the wheels there. And for some closing thoughts before we poll the question here, there are always multiple sources of data. I encourage you to definitely explore the world of GIS and all that can feed into the CRS verification process. Use what's available, so don't stress out because you're not using Esri's ArcMap or ArcPro, and then things like that, the fancier tools. And then always keep your sights on better though. So if you're using the grid overlay and you're sketching out 1 year, the next year maybe you can try QGIS and explore a little bit around there. But data stewardship is vital. This I'm just trying to touch on the overall maintenance of things. GIS practitioners are responsible for maintaining their own stuff. We don't have a mom or dad role they can clean up the house for us, so we've got to do that. And then they continually update all that information as it's worked through year after year. And by year 5, if this is kind of your mantra, you can come out and get a lot of really awesome points and credit because of the complexity of the data sets, and the accuracy of the numbers going in are much more accurate, so the numbers coming out are as perfect as they can be. So with that, I'd actually request the poll question now.
Okay. We will launch the poll question. Remember everybody to come out of full screen mode. And if you cannot put in your answer, go ahead and type it into the questions tab. Where can you obtain data to leverage to work through mapping for CRS? FEMA, state agencies, open data, local government department, planning, building, environmental, etc., or all of the above? Where can you obtain the data? And we will close and share the results. 96% all of the above. A few did say FEMA.
All right, so if I have time, I know I'm close to the 30-minute mark here, but does anybody have any questions they want to ask?
I do not see any questions in the questions box, and no one has their hands raised.
All right. Well,
if you want to go ahead and unmute too, you could ask a verbal question, correct, Sally?
Absolutely. I have most everybody unmuted. There's a few that you are self-muted, but there's a few that are not. So raise your hand. That's clicking the little hand there beside your name. You can ask a question. You can unmute yourself. We encourage that. Go ahead, Alex. I see you. Whoop. Nope. He muted himself back.